Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your short bio break in between two talks. And it's my pleasure to welcome you again and to introduce Andrea Petroczi to you. Andrea is professor at Kingston University as a research professor in London. And maybe she's one of the best known internationally recognized anti-doping experts in the world. And therefore, we are pretty happy to not only have her on board for this particular project, but also here with our university, for instance, because she's not only affiliated with Kingston University, but with the WGI here in Münster, with the KU Leuven in Belgium, and with the Foro Italico in Rome. She was responsible for two of the work packages within this Respect P project, and therefore we are pretty much looking forward her talk and her brief introduction into the results and the consequences of our research. Andrea, happy to have you here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. No pressure after the previous talk, listening to myself being cited so many times. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, that looks fine, hopefully. Okay, I will keep looking at my notes because that's the only way I can guarantee that I will be within the 25 minutes. So hope you bear with me, but I'm absolutely happy to try to take questions at the end. I try to finish in time to allow times for questions. So wish me luck. Let me start with sharing some behind the scenes stuff. So my job within this project was to review the literature and scope the other available information on doping in parasports, because the big question is, what do we know about it and how big of the problem is? So when Ian asked me to talk about the outcomes of this work package now, the prospect of doing so truly terrified me. And it was for two reasons. One, I really didn't want to present something that was 2 years past its sell-by date. And the second was, there isn't too much to present to begin with. So I opted for a different approach, and I hope you will find it informative and thought-provoking. So after almost 2 days of talking about doping and why athletes dope, I would like to present a different view, which is talking about the athlete vulnerability in parasports and generally the vulnerability of the sports as a whole. And all athletes are vulnerable and not because of the parasport element, but because they are elite athletes, and that's involved the clean athletes. And how that happens, I will come to that later. I'm moving way too fast. There you go. So let's start with, what do we know about doping in sport and how it started? So as I said, in 2020, the work package 2 looked at what information is available on doping in parasports. And these included the WADA reports on adverse analytical findings and sanctions for anti-doping rule violations, the testing figures, and we also conducted a mapping literature review on doping and anti-doping in parasports. So the results of this review showed a very patchy knowledge structure with limited number of empirical studies for some aspects and more considerable segment of what we called armchair research. They are raising questions but offering very little empirical evidence. But in the same process, we find some other interesting issues under doping and anti-doping, which by definition, or definitely not by WADA definition, it does not fall into the category of doping, yet it's discussed as such. Again, I will come to that a bit later on. So how to solve that situations? You know, we have literature, but it doesn't really fit into anti-doping. And then 2 years has passed, and now we benefit from having information from the athletes themselves, with ASPs working with para-athletes. So I try to reverse that process, and now armed with evidence from the international focus groups that we conducted with elite para-athletes in 6 European countries, I returned to the task of doing the review on just quick for now for this talk, but later on expand it to possibly to a full publications. But this time, with targeted searches focusing on the key issues raised by the focus groups, rather than trying to search the broader scope of anti-doping and see what happens. So to capture this sort of upside down process, I actually borrowed the terminology from medicine. So we talk about reverse mapping review, which is something I just invented now. I borrowed the terminology from medicine, where axillary reverse mapping refers to the technique of practically injecting a blue ink or some fluorescent ink into the arm to identify the lymph nodes that the sentinel lymph nodes that they have to remove as part of the surgical procedure treating breast cancer. So the basic concept is we don't take out all the nodes, but we are focusing on ones that are affected. And to identify these nodes, we are injecting this blue ink into someone's arm and then see which nodes are highlighted. So I follow the same process for doing the literature review. And this time, the ink was the issues raised by the athletes and athlete support personnel in the past 2-3 years. I'm not going to go through details now, but I will reflect on every single one later on as we progress. Let's start with the WADA statistics. The WADA reports tell an interesting story, and that story is not dissimilar to what we are already familiar with. And listening to the previous talk, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on that to unpack what actually that 1% means. So looking at the number of tests or number of samples taken in parasports, you can see a significant marked increase from 2013 to 2019, going from somewhere around just under 5,000 samples taken all the way up to now it's reaching 12,000. So it's doubled over that period of time. Obviously, the statistics are available for well before 2013. The only reason I'm limiting to the presentation to that is because the anti-doping rule violation statistics are only available for this period of time. Surprisingly, the number of anti-doping rule violations increased, but it did not increase at the same rate, which is pretty much the answer to doing more testing does not necessarily means that we are going to have more positive cases. So you see that it's the number of anti-doping rule violations actually ranging somewhere between 40, with some fluctuations going up to just shy of 70. So it's not exactly double, but yes, it's increased a lot, but it's along the line of the increase in number of testing. So the number of samples taken is actually, so put it in our context, is actually a fraction of the overall samples taken in sports for doping control. It's account for not even 5%. So then you can tell where the focus really is in terms of testing. So what does it actually mean? It's more informative if we are actually looking at some of the more detailed statistics. So you can see that the ratio between adverse analytical findings or positive doping test, if you like, in lay terms, and the number of samples taken is around 1.6%, with some variations, obviously, between 1 and slightly over 2%, but it's not that dissimilar to the 2% average range in able-bodied sports. If you're looking at the conversion rate, which is out of the adverse analytical findings, how many actually turns into a sanction anti-doping rule for anti-doping rule violations, the conversion rate is around 40%, which is just below that typical conversion rate in able-bodied sport. But again, we are pretty much in the same ballpark. And finally, if you look at the effectiveness of the testing, so how many anti-doping rule violations we actually have from all the testing that's been done, it's less than 1%. On average, able-bodied sport is around 1%. The reason between the conversion rate and the reason for losing, if you like, positive cases is because some of those with adverse analytical findings do not have a case to answer. They have therapeutic use exceptions in place, or the case is still pending. The big question is around the TUEs, because that's one of the urban myths in sports and generally probably in parasports even more so, that TUE is a way to cheat the system. TUE is the way we can actually legally dope, because we just have to manipulate the TUE system. Actually, the evidence doesn't show any support for that. I could not get statistics available for Paralympics specifically, but there is a published paper by Alan Wernick from WADA and his colleagues that was in 2020 that showed that it's less than 1% of the Olympic podium positions had TUE in place, which is pretty much deflate the assumptions that TUE, misuse of TUE and cheating with TUE is a widespread problem. Based on the previous pictures, there is no reason to believe that parasports would behave differently. Moving on and still getting some information from the literature, there was an interesting article published in 2020, which looked at research projects conducted during game times at the Paralympic Games between 1996 Atlanta and 2018 in Korea. And what you see in that picture is there's a fairly equal split between 4 areas focusing on athletes' health and performance, socioeconomical determinants of Paralympic participation and success at the Olympics, and the classification system. Interestingly, there was one study coming under this period on boosting, which is classified under the athletes, coaches, education, along with another projects on energy intake, body composition, and bone density in Paralympic athletes, and another one on Paralympic coaches' expertise, which, if you ask me, it's a rather peculiar set of education. However, these groupings are not arbitrary because they follow the IPC research strategic goals that was formulated in 2013. Looking at the issues that now will discuss later on, there is a question whether that strategic goal strategy should be revised 10 years on. Finally, we are moving on to what we know in the literature about parasports, which again, it's revealed that anti-doping related empirical research is rather scarce. There are mainly book chapters, theoretical papers, and opinion pieces, which they way outnumber the number of studies actually offering empirical evidence base for prevention, education, or policy development. There is an interesting element, which is integration of transgender intersex athletes are actually coming up under the search of anti-doping, which means they are taking a note to parasports, probably, and I'm guessing it is because of the protected classification rather than the issue of the integration of the intersex athletes. And then there is a wide range of studies that actually nodding to doping, but the main focus is really around where and how para-athletes might be vulnerable because of their condition, their unique needs, the expensive participation, inequality in funding, and opportunities. So they are, if you like, focusing on vulnerability factors as an athlete due to the nature of them participating in parasports. What I would like to present next is actually looking at vulnerability factors, not because they are para-athletes, but because they are competing in elite sports and elite athletes. So let's look at the vulnerability concept next. When we are talking about vulnerability, intuitively, we understand what it is. And this is one of those general notions we often talk about confidentially and assuming that we all know what it means. And we also assume that it means the same thing for everyone else. But when we are actually challenged to explain that, then the trouble starts. And this is not dissimilar to the notion of clean sport and clean athletes. We intuitively feel what it is, and we know what clean sport is. But we are challenged for a definition. We often puzzled and offer this definition by describing what is not clean sport, assuming that the opposite should be the clean. So going back to the vulnerability, do we actually understand the same way vulnerability concept as our colleagues in practice, or in as understood by the athletes? So let's look at the dictionary definition first. Vulnerability is, in one hand, being greater risk of being physically or emotionally harmed because of disparities in physical, economic, and social status when compared to the dominant population. So we are talking about, are para-athletes more vulnerable simply because of their disabilities and their conditions compared to the able-bodied athletes? Or maybe the young person underage falls in the same category. The other meaning of vulnerability is being susceptible to something bad happening to us. So for example, an athlete who are not properly educated in anti-doping might commit an anti-doping rule violations inadvertently. The next one is being capable, being persuaded by or tempted by, pressurized to do doping. And this is what Manfred before me talked about. Are their athletes vulnerable to actually tempted to do dope for personal circumstances, being in a perfect storm when they see no other way out? And I also would like to focus on, and this is my passion in the past few years, focus on the clean athletes, who I think also vulnerable, not because they fall onto any of the previous categories, but because they are living under constant stress and chronic stress and anxiety about worrying about failing to doping tests, be labeled as dopers, although they have no intention to do so. And it's also reflect on the difficulties of actually complying with anti-doping rules and demands of the anti-doping. That includes testing, that includes the whereabouts system, and it includes being under surveillance pretty much all the time for no reasons, because they are part of a system that is optimized for catching the cheats rather than protecting their rights. So let's look at vulnerability from a slightly different point of view, which is the system approach. And I appreciate that the graphs is quite complex. So just bear with me and focus on the headlights. Managing vulnerability requires a system approach, which describes vulnerability, simply put, as a gap in our defense system against a specific threat. This threat presents a risk for potential harm if it's not protected against it. Importantly, vulnerability also means that there is an element of the person's willingness to accept this risk and take actions to mitigate against them where possible. So athlete vulnerability is not a passive concept, but is a dynamic, it's situated, and athletes do have a responsibility. So does the system. So therefore, athlete vulnerability is a dynamic combination of the degree to which he or she exposed to the risk of harm, such as doping or inadvertent rule violations, and the defense system he and she has in place to protect against this risk or mitigate against the risk and its likelihood or severity. So then it means that yes, vulnerability presents in sport, but it also means that there is things we can do against it. One is the athletes should have the ability to manage their own vulnerabilities, which requires maybe a part of the education. But there is also a demand on the system to put protection in place and mechanism in place to protect athletes from all kinds of harm. The latter involves, but not limited to, anti-doping education. It also includes, or should include, offering help to clean athletes to live with the doping environment, cope with being under constant suspicion and surveillance, and to pay more attention to meaningful corrective actions, such as timely medal reallocation and timely results management for the victims, not just focusing on catching the perpetrators. So what kind of threats are we actually talking about in parasports that we need to have protection against? In the next few slides, I'm going to use some quotes, direct quotes from participants who were part of our research groups, part of our research and focus groups. For those who are concerned about the ethics, please rest assured that I'm only using direct quotes from the pieces that these athletes were willing to tell to camera. So there is no hiding of their personality or their identities. So I'm not breaking any confidentiality rule here. Obviously, I only catching a few quotations from these just to illustrate the points that I would like to talk about, not pretending that this is the whole picture. But in line with the reverse mapping, I try to look for the issues, what else we know about that in the literature. So the first one, and the big question obviously, is the doping and therapeutic use exceptions. And as I argued based on the statistics, it does not seem like a big problem. Yes, there are dopers. Yes, there are 1%. Yes, it does happen. But I think that the belief that the doping is widespread is bigger without much evidence, and there's speculations about the greater potential of misuse of TUE, again, is not supported with evidence. But as one of our participants said, explaining why doping might be actually less of an issue in parasports is because, in his argument, the health is more precious to them than it might be in able-bodied athletes, particularly for those who came to the disabilities through illness or some events in their life. The next issue is, I'm going to the big one, the big elephant in the room, which is the classification manipulation. Ali is one of the most vocal advocate for athletes' rights and anti-doping. Coming from a sport specific, because he's a powerlifter, coming from the sport where classification is not that of an issue because it's based on weight categories. But as he said, when he can actually find out that other athletes are somewhat openly talking about how they can game the system, not necessarily even seeing that as a cheating, it makes him very, very angry. He is not alone with this. And this is a very interesting topic because if you look at the literature, there is certainly an amount of publications and studies has been done talking about the classification system. You saw the projects listed under Paralympic Games, which is one of them, is about the classification system. So the problem around the fairness and unfairness of the system is a well-known phenomenon, and it has been researched quite extensively with the intention to improve it. And it's not about that athletes want to have N=1 classification when they are all unique. They are willing to accept that to make the sport viable, they have to compete in the categories when the abilities varies widely. The problem is those who are actually manipulating that system and gaming the system to trying to take advantage of the classification. By manipulation is intentionally misrepresenting their ability. But there is also an element to that, which is how much athletes are actively doing it, or how much is it happening to them. One example would be if a coach wants to play the game and they know when the classification happens, then they can make sure that the athletes are very heavily trained the day before or just before the competition. So they are genuinely not able to perform to their best abilities. What is interesting here, though, is although the problem, the fairness in classification is extensively researched relatively compared to the other areas, but it's never within the discussion of how to game the system and whether that can be used as cheating. So this is a lot more to be done here. The next, and also we find it very interesting that athletes who are willing to talk about that, they always talk about that. When we start asking about doping, the discussion derailed within 5 minutes, saying, yes, doping, yes, it is a problem, but we have a much bigger problem, which is the classification manipulation. Yet, very few willing to talk openly or to camera about this. The next issue is technology, and for avoidance of doubt, Oscar Pistorius was not part of our para-athlete sample. I wish he would. But I could not find an athlete interviewed on camera to attribute the quote to. But another major segment of the literature, if you like, is talking about the impact of technology and the impact on parasports, the authenticity of the performance, accessibility, equality is widely discussed in parasports. And it's interestingly put by the quote from one of the OR participants is actually the issue around Pistorius' special blading competition is actually that they was limited to what kind of blades he can use because the system did not want the para athletes to actually run faster than the able-bodied ones. Apart from that, yes, it's often an opportunity to cheat, which is not discussed. The discussion typically in the literature focuses or revolves around the boundaries between what is performance enabling and what is the boundary between performance enhancing technologies and the impact of technological advancement on the spirit of sport. And also it's create an issue around affordability and fairness, because we know that with every technical sports, money actually can buy you a better equipment, which leads to better performance and better results. The next two items are not necessarily coming from, there's not much on the literature, but it was raised by the participants, and I think going forward, these are important issues. One is around the integrity education and the need to broaden the education from anti-doping to the full spectrum of the integrity issues. This is certainly not specific to parasports, but with concerns over classification and potentially harmful practices such as boosting or elective treatment in parasports, that's underscored the need for a more holistic approach in education. And with that one, parasports is pretty much in line with the new developments that we see in able-bodied sports when the system seems to be moving from just anti-doping to a broader integrity, even organizations or education. And the next one is an interesting issue because there is no evidence for that in the literature, and is definitely not coming from the athletes' discussions, but it's driven partly by the anecdotes and my informally in discussions around sanctioning para athletes. And one of the assumption was usually CAS decisions reasoning for a more lenient treatment and more lenient sanctions for para athletes because they already went through so much and they already had a hard life. So I don't know how much it is actually the case or the issue, or just, again, it's another urban legend and assumptions. But I thought it would be a good idea to ask athletes about this when we interviewed them. And without exceptions, every single one said, definitely it should not be the case. They want to be treated the same way as the able-bodied athletes, because they said cheating is cheating, doesn't matter who does it. And also because they think that they fought so hard to have the para sports have similar or the same recognition as able-bodied sports in terms of being an elite athlete. They definitely don't want to risk that by having different or more lenient treatment. Research needs to be done in this area if the assumption is actually has any merits. And finally, we are talking about the integration of para athletes and para sports into the broader scope of sport and elite sport. And yes, there are some research around this issue, talking about the global fairness, the influence of economic factors, but there are also management issues, because physically integrating para sports into the able-bodied sports in a major sport event settings is actually not just the political will, but it has its own complexities. So, sort of concluding, I'm going back to the same model as I had before, and looking at para athletes' vulnerabilities specifically this time, and what sort of defense mechanism can we have in place. Without trying to be comprehensive, that looks like the para athletes' vulnerability is coming from the following factors. There is a risk of losing out on medals and opportunities due to doping or intentional misrepresentation by others in the athlete environment. So these are the victims that are also vulnerable. Classification manipulation by people in the athlete environment, as I alluded to, that might be coaches or other people around the athletes is manipulating the system without the actual consent from the athletes. There are also the personal circumstances, the identity, the financial situations, the compromises they have to make in classification system in order to make the sport viable. That also makes them vulnerable to some degree. And then, of course, there is the risk of temptation to dope, and there's a risk of inadvertent anti-doping rule violations due to the TV complexity in para sports, probably higher than in able-bodied sports. There is also an inherent challenges in testing procedures, because, and I'm not sure that the anti-doping educations actually cater for these complexities at the moment. And the last element is the fast progression to elite level in some cases, particularly if someone acquired disability due to an accident or injury or coming from the armed forces. So they are, if you like, fast-tracked into the elite level sports, and sometimes anti-doping education cannot catch up with that speed appropriately. So then the question is, what can we do about it? Obviously, part of it can be addressed by anti-doping education, empowering athletes to protect themselves. But there is also a responsibility for us and for the system to try to deal with that. So there is a need for new policies and developing education materials, potentially focusing on earlier education, and making sure that the education is accessible and appropriate for the population we intend to help. So to allow time, I will have 2 more slides, but I don't go to that one for now. I would like to leave some questions. Being an academic, I really would like to finish with the research is scarce in the literature, and more research is needed. I definitely don't want to see more of the same research. It's not the call for repeating the same that we did for the past 20 years in able-bodied sports. Repeat all of that in para sports. The last thing I want to see is yet another attitude study in para sports. but focusing on the issues that is actually pertinent to the population that I hope I raised enough to start this. And I do believe that involving athletes, involving the practitioners into this process is paramount. And working together, academics and practitioners, I think we can make a difference for the para athletes and the sport. So thank you. And I stop sharing.
Thank you, Andrea, for this complete new perspective on our results. And beyond that, actually, although we are a bit over time, I would say we take the time the next 5 minutes for questions from the crowd. So who wants to start? Jules Wolf.
Hello, Andrea. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very interesting. I had a quick question about item number 7. You mentioned the potential for fast tracking for those who have acquired disability versus congenital. I'm just kind of curious, is there any empirical evidence to show that there's a greater number of acquired disabled athletes fast tracking versus, say, congenital, or?
No, probably that's a relatively, well, I wouldn't say easy to track, but it's possible to track. No, it's something coming from the discussion we had with athletes, and we also had one focus groups with the Invictus Games athletes who are coming through the military route, acquired injuries. The concern there is, so for example, if there's an athlete coming through being an athlete in their lives, so they already were trained in a particular sports, they are physically very capable athletes, they have an injury. As part of the rehabilitation, later on they're coming back to sports, they progress to elite level faster than those who are going through the normal development process. And the same is true for the military personnel is coming through injuries. There is often not enough time for education first approach, simply because the athletes are coming at a different speed to the elite level. So often their first experience with anti-doping is actually being tested rather than being educated about how it's going to happen. To what proportion is that? I cannot answer, but probably that's a very good research project for someone who want to dig into that. And also the relevant to that would be very interesting to see if those who are fast-tracked because of the circumstances has a greater proportion of inadvertent anti-doping rule violations, because that would be related to the timely or missing out on a timely education.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions?
We made up the time.
Yeah. If this is not the case, then thanks again, Andrea, for this pretty comprehensive talk in almost 30 minutes. And we continue with a short break, and we will start our program again on 1:50 Central European Time, so in 12 minutes, with a panel discussion. Ian introduced the panel discussion at the very beginning of our day, so we will have international experts on the field and athletes from our project, and Andy Hayes will take over then. See you in 12 minutes.